So let's talk a little bit about the ontology of this hukm. When I say ontology, I mean its existence in terms of being. So we have different schools of thought here on this question, right? So the first one you can say is the position of most jurists, most fuqaha. And the tradition calls it the mukhatti'ah. And it comes from the word khata, which means mistake. Okay? And so it starts from the proposition that God would not oblige us to do ijtihad unless God has a rule in mind. So even though the texts of Revelation are limited, al-adilla mahsura, or al-adilla mutanahiya, right? Because there's only a finite number of verses and a finite number of hadith and a finite number of cases of ijma'. Despite that, according to them, it would be meaningless for God to say we have to do ijtihad unless God in fact has a rule that we are supposed to discover. So they understand ijtihad on the analogy of a bowman trying to hit a target, right? So when you're engaged in ijtihad, you're seeking out, you have a hadaf, a goal. The hadaf is with God, what God actually has adjudicated and resolved in the case. And just like any other archer, you might hit the target, you might hit the bullseye, or you might miss it entirely. You might be like way off, right? But the point is, only one opinion is right, because God has a definitive rule for everything. Okay? Now, in some ways, this derives from Shafi'i's discussion of ijtihad and the duty of ijtihad. And so Shafi'i justifies this duty by analogy to the qibla. So if you read Shafi'i's writings in al-Risala and also Jima' al-Ilm, etc., and Kitab al-Umm, he says, look, there's a nas in the Quran that says Muslims must face al-Masjid al-Haram when they pray. So that's nas, right? It doesn't admit of more than one meaning. Okay? And then it tells us, حَيْثُمَا كُنْتُمْ فَوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ etc. So there's a command also to do it wherever you are. Okay? Now, by necessary rational implication, if you are outside of Mecca, you cannot see the Kaaba. So what do? You do ijtihad. You rely on the stars, other landmarks, etc., 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 and you calculate the qibla, right? And so Shafi'i says, by doing so, you have fulfilled your legal obligation, whether or not, in fact, you are facing the Kaaba. Because your obligation is not to actually face it in situations where it is not visible to you, but rather to use these different physical signs to determine its direction. So he says the same thing applies for all other rules of the Sharia. That if there is no express rule for it, then you are commanded to use the equivalent of the stars, like other pieces of evidence, other kinds of reports, etc., to arrive at a probable conclusion. And by doing so, you fulfilled your duty to God. So they say, this school says that every mujtahid is either correct or mistaken. But if he is mistaken or if she is mistaken, she incurs no sin. Okay, so there's no sin involved in being mistaken, but you are mistaken. Okay? There's only one opinion, right, that is correct. Now, we can never know what that opinion is until the Day of Judgment. But as far as I am concerned, I am right. I have to believe that my opinion is true. Okay? So, this is a kind of dogmatic position, right? In the sense that if you adhere to it, you have to argue that your view is correct, even though it's impossible for you to demonstrate that your position is correct. So this is the great weakness of this. It's intuitively very attractive because you want to think that there's a right answer for every argument, for every question. But from a practical perspective, it raises a problem in that no one is in a position to be able to justify through demonstration, rational demonstration, that her opinion is true in the way that a mathematician can demonstrate that the Pythagorean theorem is true. Right? This is sort of the gold standard, a rational proof. A rational proof, no rational person can deny. But a legal proof is amenable to being rejected by rational people. That's the problem, essentially. So the Mukhatta'a have no explanation for this. They just say it would be incoherent to engage in ijtihad unless there were a true answer. Right? So they posit that there's a true answer for everything because they think without that, then it would be abath. It would be pointless. So this jurist, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, has this famous statement. Well, I'll get to that in a second. Because what are they arguing against? There's another position called musawwiba. The musawwiba are the theologians, the mutakallimun. The mutakallimun say there's no such thing as true ijtihad and false ijtihad. And the reason why there's no such thing as true ijtihad and false ijtihad is because God doesn't have ahkam that He hasn't communicated to us. So when the mujtahid engages in ijtihad, it's not as though his opinion can be described as corresponding to something that is coexistent with God. Remember, you have to understand kind of the metaphysics of this. There's this idea that divine speech is eternal. And all the ahkam are part of God's divine speech. And so the dalils are evidence of the ahkam in God's mind, so to speak. So the mutakallimun say it's an absurdity to think that God has ahkam if there's no dalil indicating them. Right? Because according to particularly the Ash'aris, their definition of a hukm is khitabullah. So they define the hukm as khitab, as an address, an act of communication. So if God has not communicated to us, for example, that beer is haram, then we cannot posit that this hukm is part of divine speech, eternal divine speech. Okay, such that we can describe Abu Hanifa's fatwa to be wrong and Shafi'i's fatwa to be right. Okay, so it's just logically, it's epistemologically incoherent to attribute the idea that God has a rule for everything. Instead, God imposes upon this rule for us to do ijtihad. Okay, and that ijtihad is, as I said earlier, that whatever conclusion you reach, provided that it is a product of ijtihad, that is the rule that applies to you. But unlike the Mukhatta'a, who also agree with that, they then go on and say that that rule has nothing to do with God. It's entirely a product of your human reasoning. Okay? Now, Ghazali is particularly radical in this regard. So he says part of the confusion here is the term dalil, which he accuses the jurists of being promiscuous in their use of the term dalil. So he says a dalil is only a kind of proof that leads to certainty, i.e. a burhan. Okay? But the problem in fiqh is that we fuqaha, including himself, we use lots of things as evidence that are equivocal. So most of fiqh, he says, is based not on dalil, but what he says, amara. Amara is a sign. And he says amarat are equivocal. They can be understood in various different ways, right? And so when a jurist makes an argument, an ijtihad, and he's using amara and not dalil, it's going to result in divergent conclusions. Okay? And this is where I think he's particularly radical in his subjectivity. He then says that the psychology of the mujtahid is going to be dispositive. So some mujtahids will find particular amaras to be very, very powerful and persuasive, and therefore they will give effect to it. Other mujtahids, because of their psychological composition, won't be moved by it at all. So he says that the relationship of an amara to the mujtahid is like iron to a magnet. Right? Some things are attractive and some things aren't. That's just the way it is. Okay? So he has this, he's very dismissive of the muqatta'ah. His adversary, his great adversary at the time, was called Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi. And so Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi was very dismissive of Musawwibah, and he had this statement, it was sort of a funny statement. He says, أولها صفصة وآخرها زندقة. So Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi said the Musawwibah position is, it begins in sophistry and ends in heresy. And so Ghazali says, this is the statement of a simple-minded jurist. هذا قول فقيه ساذج. Okay. So those are two, we can recognize them as the kind of opposites in the spectrum between objectivity, the rational objectivity of revelation, and the subjective particularity of revelation.